The snow came early that year, falling in slow, deliberate silence across the town of Elmswood. It clung to the wooden signs above the mercantile, softened the sound of hooves along Main Street, and turned even the gallows post white with forgetting. But there, in the center of the square, something too cruel for snowfall was being arranged. They brought her out just before sunrise barefoot, her skirt too thin for the wind, her hair uncombed like grief that no one had the decency to name. Ruth Callahan, once a rancher's wife, now stood trembling on a splintered crate while a dozen men stood in front of her like bidders eyeing a worn saddle. Behind her, her brother-in-law Eli grinned like a man who believed the law had chosen him as its sword. "She's strong enough," he said, unrolling a slip of paper with the names of creditors. "Cooks decent, sews fast, can still bear children. Her late husband left debts. We're settling them how the law allows, through fair auction of service." Ruth didn't speak. Her chin was lifted, but not high enough to hide the shame that painted her cheeks. Her fingers clutched the hem of her shawl like it might stitch dignity back into her bones. Someone in the crowd chuckled. Someone else spat. Across the street, a figure leaned against the edge of the blacksmith's stable, half in shadow, arms folded like crossed fences. Chaska, the Apache widower, said nothing. He watched. Not the way a man watches a spectacle, but the way a hawk watches a fire from across a canyon, knowing it can leap, knowing it may have to. No one really knew when Chaska had first arrived in Elmswood. He came down from the mountain after the spring thaw 3 years back, carrying only a saddle, a cracked war medal, and the silence of someone who'd already buried too much. He rarely spoke, never begged. He trained horses that others couldn't break and repaired broken harnesses with the patience of prayer. The town called him the ghost that feeds itself, and mostly left him alone. But now, his silence felt like something too heavy for the wind to carry. The first bid came from Mr. Darnsby, the undertaker, $2 and board for the winter. "Just need someone to keep the house from falling apart," he mumbled. A murmur passed through the crowd like cattle feeling a storm come in. Then the butcher spoke up. $3. "She can scrub my floor if she don't eat too much." Ruth wavered. Her knees bent slightly. Her breath steamed in the morning cold. Eli banged a tin bell. "Do I hear more?" No one noticed the moment Chaska began to walk. He moved without announcement, boots crunching through snow, each step quiet but final. When he reached the crate, he said nothing for a long breath. Just looked at Ruth, then at Eli, then back to Ruth. And then he reached into the pouch on his belt and pulled out a silver ring. Simple, engraved, worn by time. He placed it gently on the edge of the crate. "I take her as wife." Eli blinked, then laughed, full of something sour. "You don't think so, Redskin? You think this is a game?" Mayor Trundle cleared his throat. The old man's voice had always been soft, the kind of soft that let cruelty echo louder. "Well, technically, there's no law against it. If both parties consent and it happens here and now. Might even settle the debt, if they marry." Chaska turned to Ruth. "Do you say yes?" And here, in this 1 inch of time, the world stopped. Even the snow seemed to hover, undecided. Ruth looked at him, not the way a woman looks at a man, but the way a person looks at a fire she's not sure will burn or warm. Her lips parted. She swallowed. "I say yes," she whispered. Her voice cracked like thawing ice. The town erupted, not in cheer, but in confusion. Eli shouted. Someone cursed. But the mayor raised his hand. "Then by witness of this town, we mark them wed." Chaska stepped forward and lifted her gently off the crate. Her bare feet touched snow, but she didn't flinch. He removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders without touching her skin. Then he nodded once, and they began to walk. Side by side. Slowly. As if the world might punish them for hurrying. The townsfolk parted like wheat before a wind. Behind them, Eli stood clutching his list, rage pulsing through his temple. "She's still a Callahan," he muttered. "You can't erase blood with silence." But silence, when carried with enough steadiness, has a way of sounding like thunder. They passed the chapel. The bell didn't ring. they passed the mercantile. The windows stayed shuttered. They passed the cemetery, where Ruth's first husband lay under a crooked wooden cross. She did not look back. When they reached Chaska's horse, he helped her onto the saddle, careful as one might lift a bundle of broken arrows. Then he walked beside her, leading the horse through the drifts. Neither of them spoke, but something in their shadows stretched across the snow like old stories looked like the beginning of a different ending. A little boy, no more than 8, ran alongside the fence as they passed the edge of town. "Are you gonna live with him now?" he asked Ruth. She looked down at the boy, then back at the man beside her. And for the first time in many months, she gave a smile, small, unsure, but real. "Yes," she said. "I think I already am." The boy nodded, then ran back to whatever innocence hadn't yet been stolen by town gossip. As the morning light grew, they rode into the forest edge. Snow continued to fall, but somehow, the wind softened. Chaska looked ahead, but his hand occasionally reached back to steady the reins near her knee, never her skin, just enough to remind her she was not alone. In the distance, smoke curled from the chimney of a small cabin nestled against the trees. A bird sang from somewhere high in the pines. Ruth watched the roof appear through the flurries and whispered, half to herself, "Maybe this isn't the end of me." No one heard her. But somehow, it felt like the mountain did. The trail narrowed as they passed into the pines, snow softening their path like a hush placed gently over the world. The cabin appeared after a bend, small, square, and weather-worn, its roof sagging under snow like an old man's shoulders. Smoke whispered from the chimney, rising into the gray. Ruth held tight to the saddle horn, her hands raw, her body stiff from the cold and the weight of all she couldn't say. Chaska opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The room was warm, wood stove glowing low, the scent of cedar and broth in the air. A small table stood in the center with 2 chairs, one hand-carved. Along the walls, bundles of dried herbs hung from pegs, and a shelf held wooden figures, an eagle, a woman's face, a horse mid-gallop. He gestured to the chair nearest the fire. "Sit." Just one word. Ruth sat slowly. The warmth hit her skin like shame, as if her body had betrayed her by needing it so badly. She tucked her feet under the hem of her dress and avoided his eyes. He moved through the cabin quietly, removing his boots and placing a kettle on the stove. When he returned, he held a folded wool blanket. She hesitated, then took it with a quiet nod. He handed her a bowl of stewed beans, onion, bits of venison. Her hands trembled, so he placed it on the table instead. "You eat," he said. She tried. Spoon to lips. Chew. Swallow. But the food turned to grief in her mouth. She hadn't been fed with kindness in months, and now, every bite felt like something inside her was unthawing too fast. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. He nodded once, then pulled a stool to the far side of the room. "I'm not much company," she said, offering a weak smile. Chaska didn't answer. He leaned forward, tossing a bit of kindling into the stove. Fire cracked, then settled. Silence wrapped itself around them. Not uncomfortable, just wide. She finished half the bowl and set it down, hands folded tightly. "You didn't have to do what you did." "I know. But why, then?" He stirred the coals and paused. "I've seen a woman left in the snow before." "I didn't speak then." "I do now." Ruth blinked. She wasn't used to men meaning what they said in so few words. That night, he took the bedroll near the door. She insisted he take the bed, but he only shook his head and laid his hat over his chest, eyes closed before she could protest again. The lamp burned low. Wind rattled the walls, but inside, it was still. In the dark, Ruth stared at the ceiling beams. She'd been married once. That man had filled rooms with noise. Praise when she worked, curses when she failed. Chaska said less in a day than her late husband did in a breath. And yet, for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid to close her eyes. The next morning, he was already outside. She watched from the window as he threw hay to the horses, checked their hooves, and mended the fence rail that had split in the frost. The rhythm of his body was calm, measured. Every movement said, I have done this before, and I will do it again. She stepped out slowly, wrapping his coat tighter around herself. The sky was pale with cloudlight. What can I do to help? He pointed toward the shed. There's feed sacks. You can drag them to the barn. She did. Her boots slipped in the drifts, fingers numb through her gloves. By the third trip, her breath came ragged. She stopped, bracing her hand against the barn door. He appeared beside her without a word and lifted the next sack himself. You don't think I can manage? I think you've done more than you were made to. She looked at him, surprised. You mean women are weak? No, he said. I mean you were never meant to carry everything alone. Something in her cracked open then, not enough to weep, but enough to breathe. They worked until midday. Then he showed her how to brush the mare, long, slow strokes, down the neck and along the flank. Don't rush, he said. She feels your hurry. She feels your stillness too. Ruth nodded, brushing with gentler hands. The mare turned her head and pressed her nose into Ruth's palm. That small trust nearly undid her. In the days that followed, they didn't speak much. But the silence between them changed. It became less of a wall, more of a bridge. She learned to watch him, how he carved spoons in the evenings, how he lined up his boots just so, how he paused before speaking like he was weighing each word for worth. One evening, she stitched a torn seam on his shirt by firelight. He watched her from the other side of the room. You so quiet, he said. You live quiet, she replied. He nodded. Both are good. A knock came 2 days later. The sound startled them both. No one visited here. Chaska opened the door to find Mayor Trundle standing awkwardly, hat in hand, boots caked with snow. Behind him stood Eli, face flushed, eyes narrowed with forced civility. We came to speak with the lady, the mayor said. Chaska didn't move. Ruth stepped forward. What for? The mayor cleared his throat. Just, well, given the nature of how things occurred, some are questioning the validity of the union. There's concern. What kind of concern? Ruth asked. That maybe you felt pressured. That maybe you weren't in a right mind to consent. You could annul the arrangement. Return to your kin. No judgment. Ruth looked past him to Eli. He wouldn't meet her eyes. She exhaled slowly. I already had kin who sold me like a mule. And now I've got a man who lets me choose what I say, what I do, and where I stand. I'll stay. The mayor shifted. Very well, very well. Just had to ask. They turned to go. Eli lingered 1 second longer, then spat on the snow beside the steps. You'll regret this. Chaska stepped forward once. Just once. Eli flinched and walked away. Inside, Ruth sat at the table, her hands trembling again. Why didn't you answer for me? She asked. He shrugged. It wouldn't be your answer then. Later that night, she sat sewing by firelight again, but this time, she moved the lamp closer to his chair so the light reached them both. They didn't speak. But in the way she unfolded his mended shirt, and in the way he ran a finger along the stitches, something wordless passed between them. The kind of thing that doesn't need to be named to be real. Outside, snow fell again. But inside, something softer settled too, something warm and weightless, like the slow return of trust. And that was how the winter began. The snow had crusted over in brittle sheets by the time the knock came at midday. Ruth was sifting flour by the window, sleeves rolled high on her arms, her apron dusted like a baker's ghost. She looked up and stilled. Chaska was mending a bit of tack by the fire, his hands patient, steady. The knock came again, louder this time, as if made by someone who believed in their own righteousness. When Chaska opened the door, the wind swept in alongside Pastor Ellery. He was a small man with a long coat, snow clinging to the hem, and a beard that looked more sermon than softness. Behind him stood 2 town women, Mrs. Holcomb, the blacksmith's sister, and Clara Dunn, the widow with the lace curtains and sharp tongue. I come in good faith, the pastor said. Chaska stepped aside. But the tension in his shoulders did not ease. "Ruth," Ellery said, nodding with that tight, pained expression meant to mimic compassion. "May we talk?" She wiped her hands, removed her apron, and nodded. "If you're here to bring soup, you're a few weeks late." Pastor Ellery gave a strained smile. "It's not about food. It's about your soul." Ruth said nothing. She sat across from him, arms folded. The women remained standing, like witnesses in a courtroom. "I received word that the circumstances of your union were unusual," he began. "Unorthodox. It's important the church understand if vows were spoken in clarity, if your spirit was willing." "I said yes," Ruth answered. "I said it without a rope around my neck or a man holding a rifle to my head. That's more than I can say for some women who married under your steeple." Clara stiffened. Mrs. Holcomb's eyes narrowed. The pastor cleared his throat. "Ruth," he said, softer now, "I'm not questioning your pain. But this arrangement has caused concern. The church cannot bless what it does not understand." She looked past him, to Chaska, who hadn't sat down. He stood by the hearth, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "You want me to walk away," she said. "Return to the brother-in-law who auctioned me? Let the town patch up its shame with my sacrifice?" "No," Ellery replied quickly. Only that you consider what's right in the eyes of the Lord. You are still young. There are good men, godly men, who might offer protection and a future." She smiled then, but it was a quiet, exhausted smile. "Good men watched me sold like kindling in the snow. Not one raised a hand." He looked away. Mrs. Holcomb stepped forward. "You could still have a place here, Ruth. A proper one. We could find you something, sewing work, perhaps. We could speak to Eli." Ruth stood. Not abruptly. Just firmly. "I was proper. I was dutiful. I stayed when I should have run. I obeyed when I should have screamed. And not one of you came to my door when the beating started. Not one of you left a bowl of soup after the auction." Ellery opened his mouth, but Ruth raised a hand. "You want to know if I was in my right mind when I said yes to this man?" she asked, turning to Chaska now. "Yes. I was. And I still am." Chaska met her gaze. Nothing was said, but something passed between them, sturdy, unseen, the kind of truth that doesn't need witnesses. Ellery stood, smoothing his coat. "I only ask you to think. Pray. The Lord listens to those who seek his path." "I did seek it," she said, her voice softer now. "And maybe, just maybe, it led me here." Outside, the wind howled. When they were gone, Ruth sat again, but her hands didn't return to the flour. She stared at the table, eyes distant. "Were you afraid they'd take me back?" she asked. Chaska shook his head. "You're not mine to take." She tilted her head, curious. "If you leave, I won't stop you," he said. "I won't speak for you. Because that's what they want. Another man to speak." She looked down at her hands, rubbed her thumbs together. "Why don't you ever answer for me?" "Because your voice still works," he said. The answer wasn't cruel. It was steady. Like a lantern placed in her hand instead of lit for her. That night, she didn't sleep well. Dreams came, fractured, cold. Her old home. Eli shouting. Her name written in a ledger beside a column labeled debt. She rose before dawn and walked out into the snow barefoot. The cold bit her skin, but she didn't care. She stood by the corral, arms wrapped around herself, looking at the sky where dawn had begun to smear faint pink over the dark. She heard his footsteps behind her but didn't turn. "They'll keep trying," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I can't hide in your cabin forever." "You're not hiding," he said. "You're healing." She finally turned. "And if I never fully heal?" He looked at her, long and quiet. Then I'll still keep the fire lit." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration. It was something older, like stone. Like cedar. It asked for nothing and gave everything. She stepped closer. Close enough to smell smoke on his coat, the iron tang of horse on his skin. Will you teach me to mend tack? She asked. Yes. To set snares? Chop kindling? Yes. She hesitated. And, to ride better? Not just side saddle? A flicker of something amusement passed his face. Yes. She smiled. By midday, she was chopping wood. Her hands blistered. She cursed under her breath, but she didn't stop. He didn't correct her. Only adjusted her stance once and left her to swing. The rhythm steadied her heartbeat. The ache made her feel real again. Later that evening, she brought him tea without being asked. She placed the cup near his hand, then sat across from him with her own. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a song with no need for lyrics. A new winter had begun inside her. But this one, she would survive. And when she finally looked out at the dark window, at the world that had once sold her like meat, she didn't feel small anymore. Not quite. Not entirely. Just quiet. And strong enough to stay. The morning smoke from their hearth rose cleanly into the pale sky, as it always did, curling like memory into the frostbitten air. Ruth was humming that day, something wordless, while slicing roots for stew. Chaska was outside splitting cedar with the quiet rhythm he gave all things. The scent of snow mixed with pine, and for a while, it almost felt like peace was something that could stay. Then the dog barked. Not in greeting. Not in curiosity. But in warning. By the time Ruth flung open the door, the scent hit her burning pitch, kerosene, and rage. A smoldering torch lay just short of the porch step, its flame licking the dry beam like it had been born hungry. Behind it, smeared across their wall in crude, angry letters, were the words, "Half-breeds burn." Chaska was already beside her, stamping the flame with his boot. He tossed the smoking torch into the snowbank with a hiss, then straightened slowly. No words. No curse. No panic. But the silence that followed was not the calm kind. It was the silence before a storm learns where to break. Ruth stared at the words. Something in her chest shook loose. She hadn't cried when they sold her. She hadn't cried when the pastor questioned her soul. But now, staring at this foul scribble, she did. Only for a moment. Chaska said nothing. He touched her shoulder lightly, then walked back into the cabin. By sundown, he had hammered new boards across the outer walls. She handed him nails, her jaw clenched against the cold. They worked until their hands went stiff, until the boards covered the hate, but not the wound. No one came by the next day. Not even to pretend they didn't know. At the trading post, the man behind the counter avoided Ruth's gaze. When she asked for fabric and salt, he reached for them without a word. His hands trembled. Behind her, someone muttered, he should have stayed with his own kind. Ruth didn't flinch. She placed the coins down slowly, one by one, then turned and walked out. On the way home, she held the sack of flour like it was something fragile. Are you angry? She asked. Chaska nodded. Yes. At them? No, he said. At how long they'd been allowed to stay the same. That night, she poured hot water over his blistered hands. He didn't pull away. She dried them with her apron, then sat beside him at the fire and began to stitch the hem of a blanket that had come undone. You could leave, she said. Go back to the mountain. Or south. You don't owe anyone this. I buried my wife here, he said simply. And now, someone else walks the land beside me. She paused, needle frozen mid-thread. You think I belong here? I know you didn't belong on that crate, he said. The next morning, a rider came. Ruth saw him from the window, tall, dark hair braided back, a wide shadow at his heels. She opened the door before he reached it. Chaska, the rider called, dismounting. Chaska emerged from the barn, wiping his hands. Matto. They clasped arms the old way, forearms tight, eyes steady. Matto nodded at Ruth. I am glad, he said. Your face is not what it was before. It has light again. Ruth didn't know how to answer that, so she nodded and offered him water. They sat outside, the three of them, as snow whispered down through the tall trees. Matto spoke of raids in the southern territories, of sickness and hunger, of lands being divided with ink instead of blade. But when his voice grew quiet, he looked to Ruth again. You are happy? He asked her. She hesitated. Then, I'm learning how to be. That is enough, he said. Matto left before dark, leaving behind a bundle of herbs, a carved flute, and a silent kind of blessing. The days grew shorter. The cold deepened. Ruth began to know the patterns of the wind, the way it curled around the eaves before a snowstorm, the hollow thud it made against the cabin wall when trouble was near. One night, she found Chaska sitting on the porch, sharpening a blade with long, slow strokes. She stepped outside and handed him a steaming mug. They're not done, she said. No. They'll come again. Yes. She sat beside him. I'm not afraid of them, she said. Not anymore. I'm afraid of what I might become if I let them take this from me. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes soften. Like a curtain drawn back. You're already becoming, he said. Not because of me. Because you stayed. Ruth stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked out across the white-covered hills. I want to plant something come spring, she said. Even if it dies. I want to try. Then we will dig. The fire never reached the cabin again. But it reached their hearts, their nerves, their muscles. It reminded them that peace must be built plank by plank, kindness by stubborn kindness. One morning, Ruth found a sack of eggs on the porch. No note. No sound of horse hooves. Just warmth in a basket wrapped in linen. The next day, a parcel of thread and soap. Someone, somewhere, was watching. And maybe, just maybe, changing. That night, Ruth removed the last of her old things from the trunk. The shawl she'd worn on the crate. A cracked comb. A handkerchief embroidered with her former initials. She walked into the woods behind the cabin and buried them under a cedar tree. No tears. No prayer. Only release. And as she stood, brushing snow from her skirt, she whispered, I belong here now. The wind carried her words up the ridge like smoke from a steady flame. Back at the porch, Chaska had lit the lantern. The light pulled across the snow, golden and quiet, like a signal to anyone who dared to see them as less. Inside, the fire burned on. And somewhere beyond the hills, the town slept, still twisted in its smallness, but with one fewer woman willing to kneel before it. Dusk came with a lavender sky, the kind that made the trees seem taller and the snow beneath them glow blue in the stillness. Ruth was at the window, folding the last of the laundry, Chaska's shirt, her stitched apron, a length of muslin meant for curtains come spring. She heard them before she saw them. Hooves. Wagon wheels creaking under tension. The sound of something being dragged. She stepped onto the porch just as Chaska came around from the barn, hammer still in his hand. 5 men rode toward them, one wagon behind. In the center of the wagon, coiled like a snake, was a length of rough rope, fresh, heavy, ugly. Eli Callahan sat tall at the front, his chin high with bitterness that had found its purpose. She's coming with us, he shouted, before they'd even stopped. Sheriff signed the writ. That marriage ain't legal. Never was. No license. No priest. No law. Ruth didn't move. She watched the rope swaying slightly as the wagon halted. Chaska stood beside her, eyes narrowed, but he didn't reach for anything. Eli dismounted, boots crunching against the snow. We let you play house long enough. But I won't have my brother's widow dragging the family name through filth. She goes east. Her aunts agreed to take her in. Behind him, the sheriff remained seated. His face pale, ashamed. He didn't meet Ruth's eyes. You dragged me through filth the day you sold me, Ruth said, her voice even. And you want to fix it now with rope? You think this is about you? Eli snapped. This is about law. About respect. About. No, she cut in. This is about control. Eli's jaw tightened. You'll come now, Ruth. Or we'll drag you. Chaska stepped forward then. He didn't speak. Just moved between them, bare hands, slow breath. He looked to the sheriff, voice low but firm. Do you stand behind this? The sheriff shifted in his saddle. The paper's real, he mumbled. But I didn't expect this. You didn't expect to see her carried off in rope like cattle? Chaska asked, not angry, just clear. Again? No answer. Chaska turned back to Eli. She chooses. Not you. Not me. Eli laughed bitterly. Choose? What's there to choose? A shack? A savage? A life scraping snow off a broken porch? She already did, Chaska said. Ruth stepped forward. She moved between them now, her voice rising not in anger but certainty. I choose to stay. Eli's eyes flickered, unsure whether to be enraged or embarrassed. I'd rather be poor in peace than rich in fear, she said. I'd rather sew until my fingers bleed than wear silk and be owned. Eli stepped toward her, hand twitching near the rope. Chaska was there in half a breath. He didn't strike. He didn't shout. He simply stood, body between hers and the threat, like a wall the world couldn't knock down. Go, he said. Before I remember who I used to be. There was a beat of terrible stillness. The kind of stillness that decided lives. Eli stepped back. The sheriff finally dismounted. His voice cracked. She's spoken. That's enough. Eli turned on him. You gutless. She's spoken, the sheriff repeated. And we don't carry off wives with ropes in this town anymore. A few of the other men muttered. One turned his horse. Another spat and followed. The wagon creaked back into motion, the rope still swaying, now limp as a threat unfulfilled. Eli hesitated. His gaze lingered on Ruth, on Chaska. Then, as if realizing the town had changed while he wasn't looking, he mounted his horse and rode off without another word. Ruth stood there long after they were gone, her breath white in the fading light. You didn't raise your hands, she said quietly. They already know what these hands can do, Chaska answered. She looked at him then, long and full, like a woman seeing a home not made of walls. Inside, the fire had burned low. She stirred it gently, added another log, then turned as he stepped in. What now? She asked. Now, he said, you plant your garden come spring. She smiled. And you? I mend the fence. Keep the door open. She nodded, her eyes full of something soft and solemn. I buried who I used to be. But this feels like a beginning. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because when she reached for his hand and he didn't flinch, when she placed his palm over her heart and left it there, everything else had already been said. And outside, dusk surrendered to stars, and no rope ever reached their porch again.